Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, the co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Great to be with you.
Good. I'd like to talk a little bit about that organization called the Federal Reserve. They're still around. They're getting more inept than ever, but they're being targeted now. Everybody's looking, what's the Fed going to do? How they're going to clean up their mess? So what do you have? Do you have a few suggestions or some questions sent in to us about the Fed?
Yeah, there's some questions that come in, mostly on who these people actually are. And we're going to define, there's a lot of groups involved in keeping this whole monetary system, that they try to keep it going, and they have been keeping it going. So we'll talk about all the groups involved and who they are and what they're doing. We'll start with the FOMC. Now, we all think that we live in this great capitalist system, yet every few months, traders, the media, they all glue themselves to the television to see what a bunch of central planners are saying, and they dissect their words. So who is this FOMC, Dr. Paul, and what do they do?
Well, they're the ones who set interest rates and decide monetary policy, and they've been doing that more or less since the Depression time especially, but the Fed was created in 1913, but they have a lot of power. But their main goal is to do central economic planning, which always fails. But it's also a gimmick, because they have meetings. They're supposed to have 8 a year, and then there's this big announcement. They just had a meeting, and they come out and they make a statement, and the chairman is interviewed, and then later on you get the minutes. It's big fanfare. But I see it as mostly propaganda, just carrying a message, getting it from the people who really run things, the deep state, and they get out there. But it does have a lot of effect on the market. They dissect this, the market dissects it, and they find one word different from the month before, and they interpret it, and the markets move. Now, I actually believe that there's some people who know how fictitious the Fed really is and how inept it is, but still watch it because they know a lot of other people are going to pay attention. If it looks like they're going to raise interest rates, then they do a lot of buying and selling. But I think it is more a gimmick than anything else, and that's when they get their propaganda. But basically it's made up of 12 people, the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board, plus 5 from the regional boards, but the one member that is permanent is the New York Fed, the president of the Fed of New York, because they do the trading and they're involved in Wall Street, and that's the connection to Wall Street, and the individual there is equivalent to being a member of the board. And then of the 12 regional states, they get 4 more, and they rotate this through to make it democratic. But it's all just for show, and they really aren't the controllers. A lot of people ask me, who are these people? Who owns the Fed? And there's a little bit of confusion there. It's sort of like, does the government own it and run it? Or is it all run by privately owned individuals? And I see it a little bit more mixed. It was created by government. It was created by the Congress. But there's a lot of outside influence, the people who are behind it at the branch banks, on the Federal Reserve. You can say, well, it's not private. It's not a private bank in that sense because, they go through the process of being approved by the Senate and appointed by the president. So, but it's sort of controlled by people outside. The deep state is not part of the government, but they have a lot of influence. So I see it almost worse than privately owned. It's sort of secret in combination with big business, big banks, and a government entity that was created by government, and they have the control. So there's a lot more control by these individuals that we don't know than it is controlled by the democratic process or the Congress, because of course if Congress wants to even audit the Fed, they get hysterical about it. So the best word to use is secretive. They have several tools that they talk about and they manipulate all the time. It's mostly the manipulation of interest rates. So they have the Fed funds rate, which is the overnight rate. They have the discount rate, the monte charge banks when they borrow money. They have the prime rate, which the best customers get. So there's all these tools, and they can manipulate the money supply, the reserve requirements, and also the buying and selling of securities. And I think that's where the more the mischief is occurring right now, because technically they're allowed, to buy anything. And since QE started, they bought a lot of security and mortgages, and so it's and they can buy from their friends, and it is really a big mess. It's a lot of problems, but they're running into trouble. And it's so different than how quiet it was for decades, and even up until about 10 years ago or 8 years ago, nobody even talked about the Fed, because it was not right to criticize the Fed and audit the Fed. Today, it's different. The next downturn, which I think will come soon, the Fed's not going to, get credit for getting us out of it. They didn't get any credit for us getting out of this last recession, which we're really, in many ways, still in that recession. So that is, times are different, but times are getting much worse now. In this next downturn is going to be a serious one, and so the Fed does not have any magic whatsoever. So our new chairman is going to face a lot of challenges, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. But it's this thing called central economic planning never works, no matter how long they get away with it. And I think that's what we're facing today. But the FOMC is the body that really delivers the individual decisions on interest rates, and of course that's what they do in secrecy, and they pretend they tell us everything about what's going on, but they don't.
Right. And in an actual free market, prices will not be manipulated by government or central planners, because prices are supposed to reflect reality of supply and demand. But since the Fed creates like an alternate reality with these wild booms and busts, they're going to have other people to come and clean up the mess, or to prevent the truth from coming out. So let's talk about a group called the Plunge Protection Team. Who are these people, Dr. Paul? What do they do?
Well, I'm not sure who gave this committee that name, but it's a pretty good term. And early on, the Wall Streeters turned it on because they sort of liked it, because it came out of the crash of the stock market in 1987, and it still stands as the one-day crash. It was in October of that year. It went down 20% in one day. Can you imagine what would happen if the market went down 20%? But that was scary. And of course, the bankers and everybody else got together, and nobody really puts the blame on the president at that time, but he's the one that organized this. But it was called the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, nicknamed the Plunge Protection Team, which means when the stock markets are going down too fast, the government's supposed to do something about it to protect Wall Street. And guess who did that? 1988, a year afterwards. This was done by executive order by President Reagan. So, but it was necessary to calm the markets. They buy into this stuff. Don't ever let the corrections occur. Don't mess around with the malinvestment, because we have to preserve it. Don't mess around the debt liquidation, because we don't want to have to pay for anything. So they have to prop it up. So that's what the Plunge Protection Team was all about. But it's made up of some very powerful financial people in government and in finance that responds, of course, to the people involved in the deep state. The Secretary of Treasury is involved, and he's the chairman. You have the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He's a bit powerful, too, on manipulating. And then you have the SEC. They're the regulators, and they come in. And then also the CFTC, the commodities broker. And they sort of have a free rein to do whatever they want to do. And that's why the worse the markets get, the more mischief they have. And these are the tools that they use. I think they're real busy right now. And when you look at where the stocks are being owned, the markets, right now it's a surprise that, ordinarily they'd look at this is a bubble, it should go down, but they're very, very busy. They're buying. Central banks buy. We extend loans to other central banks. In sovereign countries now, the countries and the central banks own a lot of the stocks, and that won't last. Eventually, the markets rule out. They try to rig prices, like rigging the prices of gold, and it's a lot of mischief. It hurts a lot of people. But eventually the markets refuse to accept it, even when the government thinks they can control this. But I'm sure they're very busy. You don't get minutes from them. They don't pretend to let us know. They make a couple reports, but believe me, you'll never have a full audit of everything the plunge protection team does. But I think they're busy, and they're more busy now than ever before, because they can't allow the real value of the market to be reflected in what would be happening, because nobody knows where it would go. But I think there's a lot of people, including myself, that it would be a lot lower than what it is right now. So it's artificially kept up by these efforts. The problems are created by the FOMC and all the inflation, but a group like the plunge protection team and all these agencies, they hold it together and they fix the prices, and they don't want the truth to come out, but the truth will out.
Yes, the market always trumps the state. If history has taught us one thing, that is it. And here's another concoction that was made. And I just want to reiterate one more time, the prices, they need to be as free, totally free, not as free as possible, totally free, so that they could tell us the truth of the situation. Whereas now it's just Band-Aids over the lies. And here's another group, or another creation called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. What's their responsibility, and what do they do?
Well, this was established in 1934 in the Depression with the Gold Reserve Act. Of course, the gold was stolen from the American people by the Roosevelt administration in 1933, and yet they didn't ignore it. They know gold was very important. They didn't throw it out the window and turn it over to the market. They did the opposite. They took total control of it, took the gold from the people at $20 an ounce and then made it $35 an ounce in order to inflate and play games. Now the profit, the so-called profit that was made by being able to spend at $35 for every ounce instead of just $20 was the way that the Exchange Stabilization Fund was financed. And today you don't have an appropriations bill for the Exchange Stabilization Fund, but they're able to make interest in its supply, and they are involved. And I think they are involved in gold pricing and other commodities, and I think they're in the futures market. And I have no proof of that, but I'm just sort of suspicious that happened, because they're allowed to, because it was explicitly said that the Exchange Stabilization Fund was supposed to stabilize things, stabilize the value of gold and stabilize the exchange rates, because gold established a system where exchange rates would not be a problem. You just exchanging gold as gold. You wouldn't have to play these games. But the Exchange Stabilization Fund would be the ones that would smooth this out. If one currency went too high, or they want our dollar lower or higher, they would get in and play this mischief. And they do this all the time. The market is powerful there, but there's also the Exchange Stabilization Fund that gets involved in this, and we don't know exactly how often and when they do it, but they have the technical legal ability to do this. And once again, they don't get audited. It was established in 34, but technically it's an unconstitutional thing. It defies sound money, and the purpose is as you said in the introduction there on the question, is they want to cover their bases. It's the artificialness of this fiat currency that causes all these problems. So they come up with another gimmick, and they're all in there continuing to try to fool the people and defy the markets and keep this game going, keep the counterfeiting machine going, so that they can finance all the special interests of big banks and corporations, the military industrial complex, and the welfare state. And it satisfies a lot of people, so why get involved? Until it gets shaky, and then people are fearful it might not work. And right now we see signs that something big may happen when you see others maybe starting a competing currency dealing with gold. Just think of what the recent reports were on Russia. We know that China's been buying gold, but Russia's buying a lot of gold. And they would like nothing better the way we act on world affairs, and the way we want them to accept the dollar on our terms and reject the idea of a fixed value of currency. They have reason to really want to dethrone the dollar. And there's a trend in that direction. Just last week, there was a surprise announcement that Japan's selling a lot of our treasury bills. But even with the signs of weakness, it's not like next week, all of a sudden people are going to reject the dollar. I think it's just going to continue to, the value continue to erode on international exchange markets. And this will hurt us, because that's also the reason that we see interest rates going up, and even their term of inflation, the prices of commodities and the prices of consumer goods, and that is starting to reflect that the dollar is getting weaker. A weaker dollar means you need more dollars to buy stuff, and prices go up. And even though that's been happening, they've been in denial, and they can fudge the figures, but they're admitting they're at a point now that they have to admit that price inflation is out there, and they have to deal with this problem, and that's the big job they have.
Yes, and to close up here, Dr. Paul, the Fed has kept rates artificially low for so long that the average person, even though they may not know why, they know that they can't make any interest in the bank, so they take their money and maybe go gamble it in the stock market or on Bitcoin, or go try to flip a house. Rates have been held down for so long, and people like Peter Schiff have been on TV saying once rates go up, this whole house of cards is going to come crashing down. Can you talk about, is Peter right, and what can we expect?
Well, I think he's right, but he's like me. I don't think he has the date of its arrival, and because I don't think anybody does. But I think he and I think a lot in the same terms of what we're moving to, and the need for the cleansing of the system. People hate that word. Why would you deliberately, let people go bankrupt? Well, why would you deliberately steal money from one group and give it to another, and make one group benefit from the inflation, the other person suffer? And there will be a day of reckoning. The contest right now is the challenge the Fed has, because they know that the inflation is coming, and the consumer inflation is coming. They have to do something about getting rid of the balance sheet. So even with Yellen, they started to announce gradual, steady, teeny effort to reduce their balance sheet by raising interest rates. But it looks like the interpretation is that the CPI is indicating that it's a lot more inflation than what the Fed is admitting to, and therefore the Fed isn't doing very much, and the market will eventually dictate interest rates, which I've always predicted, because the Fed has a lot of control. But eventually, if people interpret that the dollar is losing its value, there's an inflation, factor involved, and they have to cover the inflation, because if the inflation rate is 5% and interest rates are 5%, that's zero rate inflation. So that is what happened. It's a major contest. There's no easy way for the Federal Reserve to work their way out of this, get rid of the balance sheet, and not have a collision, an economic collision course on this. So I think that we're getting much closer to that, and they think that they can just manipulate the rates. Right now, once again, the Fed, which they always do, they say, well, it's the Congress, because they spend too much money and we have to monetize that debt. Well, they don't have to. If you had a truly independent bank and you were trying to make it work, what you would do is, if the Congress is spending too much money and they can't pay for it and they don't have it, the Fed wouldn't accommodate. But the Fed facilitates this. So this idea that when things don't go well for the Fed, the Congress, they spend too much money and there's too much debt, which is true. But they can't continue to do that, because it's the system. It's the system that controls this, the big system that people benefit, and it's a special interest. But the good news is it's going to come to an end. around, and we're going to have a revision of our understanding of monetary policy, and that's why I think that there's people thinking, well, maybe we can find the answer in cryptocurrencies. Maybe the Chinese and the Russians will actually have, a gold standard, which is, a pretty wild thought. I think it's a good effort, but they're not exactly a laissez-faire economy. But who knows what will happen, other than the fact that a lot of people are thinking about what's coming, and they have to do something, and how do they preserve their wealth. The real tragedy here, whether it was in the inflation going up, it benefited the very wealthy, and the bailouts always benefit the very wealthy. And right now, in spite of what the government tells us, there's still a lot of people suffering from this, and it's a ripoff. How long have the people suffered from low interest rates? The people who were frugal and actually believed in responsibility and taking care of themselves, that they would save their money and put it in the bank and get 0.5% interest rates. And at the same time, of course, the banks don't have to worry as much about interest rates, even though they're getting a lot more than that. But they just get a handout. They can go to the Fed and they can get their bailouts. There's a moral hazard there. It's a bad system. And all these things we just talked about today, it's all an effort first to inflate, and then the next through price fixings and regulations to cover the bases and cover all their mistakes. It's economic planning that is always doomed to fail, and all this mischief is going to have to, we as a country and as a people will have to admit they're not working, and that we ought to look towards something called sound money. The founders wanted us to do that, they instructed us to do that, and actually none of this stuff that we've been talking about is constitutional. None of it is moral, and none of it is good economic policy. But they've been able to get away with it for a long time because it's financed some of the mischief of many special interest groups, whether it's the military-industrial complex fighting these wars and financing the welfare state. But it's coming to an end in one way. That's good news. The challenge is, what are we going to do about contributing to the rehabilitation and the rebuilding of a sound monetary system with the emphasis on personal liberty? Chris, I want to thank you very much for being with us today on the Liberty Report.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Very good. And I want to thank our audience for joining us, and please come back to the Liberty Report soon.